I appreciate you all being here tonight. I am Dale A. Carlson, the co-author of Corrado Parducci, a field guide to Detroit's architectural sculptor. I'd also like to mention my co-author, Einar Kvarn. He's got a curious name. He happens to be of Icelandic descent. And without Einar's guidance, I would not have been able to complete this project. I'm a member of the Berkeley Historical Committee and a resident of Berkeley since 2008. And it's always a great pleasure for me to see a group of people that are interested in learning more about Parducci. I would like to begin by thanking the Livonia Public Library and specifically Ken Benatti, who tells me some people also pronounce it Big Notty. And also I would like to thank Sister Mary Ann Smith of the Felician Sisters Convent on Schoolcraft Road between Newburgh and Levon, I believe. And she was very helpful in letting me inspect the interior of her convent's chapel. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about a lot of different Parducci commissions. Most that are right here in the local area and within the state of Michigan, but we're also going to touch on a few that are outside the state of Michigan. I'm going to start first, though, with a little bit of a biography on myself and Parducci. We'll start with me, because a lot of people, when they find out I've written a book about Parducci, they are really curious about how I got into this kind of thing. So I'll try to be real quick with it. I grew up in Traverse City, Michigan, and in the early 90s, I began to attend Michigan State University. And at that time, I was very deeply interested in music and live music performance. And I would frequently travel to the city of Detroit to take in events of the house and techno music scene that were really exploding in Detroit around that time. And as a person who grew up in Traverse City, I was really struck by the grandiosity of the buildings that I found in traveling around Detroit. And I started to take a bigger interest in them. I ran into one of my friends I grew up with in Traverse City around 1993, somewhere in the city. I can't remember where. He was attending an architecture program at the University of Detroit. And he recommended that I check out the Guardian building, which I did. And it was very moving for me, and it immediately deepened my interest in Detroit architectural history. Shortly after that, in about 1993, I bought my mom a book for her birthday, Buildings of Michigan by Catherine Bishop Eckert, and I immediately borrowed it from her and have never returned it. And for many years, I've traveled around the state with this book. It's been a huge influence on me as an architectural historian, and that got me even more deeply interested in the architectural history of our metropolis and our states. So fast forward to about 2008, I purchased my first digital camera. And the first thing I start doing when I get it is driving around the city aimlessly, just taking pictures of all my favorite buildings. And it doesn't take me long at all to amass a massive archive that I want to show off in places other than just, Facebook and social media sites. So with the help of my friends in 2011, I launched a website called ilovedetroitmichigan.com, where I would begin to write about architectural history and post a lot of my photography. Well, it didn't take long after that other local architectural historians began to take an interest in what I was writing about and would occasionally contact me with, corrections, inquiries, just to talk about architectural history in general. And one of these architectural historians was my co-author, Einar Kvarn. Einar, after a few months of communicating, revealed to me that in the 1990s, he hunted down one of Corrado Parducci's sons, Alan Parducci, who was living in Los Angeles, retired from a professorship at UCLA. And he got to know Alan a little bit, went out and visited him in person, and Alan gave him permission to photocopy all of Parducci's original studio ledgers from his studios in Detroit, as well as a scrapbook that contains over 700 images of a sculpture that Corrado modeled over the course of his career. Well, as soon as Einar told me about these ledgers, oops, I'm sorry. I've got to go, one moment, please. I got to wait for the drop-down menu to disappear so I can hit the play button and we can begin looking at my presentation here. Hopefully everybody can see it all right. Ken, please let me know if anybody's having any trouble. So as soon as Einar let me know about these ledgers, and here's a photo of one page in the cover, my mind started clicking and I got into my head that I wanted to write a book about this. And this was around 2012, 2013. I went to work on it at that point, and it took me a long time to finish it. And there was two major reasons why. Number one, I have a late wife who was diagnosed with a terminal form of brain cancer in 2014. And I cared for her until her passing in 2015 for 16 months and pretty much put the book project on hold during those months. And also around 2018, I decided that the quality of my photography needed to be improved before I put up my book. And I spent almost all of 2019 reshooting about 90% of what you'll see inside the book. And there's about 300 commissions, so it was a lot of photography. Finally finished it late 2019, published in January 2020, just in time for COVID to strike and ensure that all the presentations of this nature I would give in the future are on Zoom. Really looking forward to doing this in person, hopefully sometime this summer. So let's talk about Parducci now. Parducci was born in Buti, Italy. That's a town about 10 miles west of Pisa in the year 1900. And in the year 1904, he immigrates to the United States with his father. The rest of the family came later. And they moved to a street in New York, in Greenwich Village, called Meadow Lane, and it's only a couple blocks from Washington Square and this other important location known as Mcdougall Alley. At this point in American history, Mcdougall Alley is pretty much the center of American sculpture culture, especially as it pertains to monumental and memorial sculpture, commissions that are made by the federal government. Important sculptors with studios in this area around this time are Carl Bitter, Augustus St. Gaudens, Daniel Chester French, Paul Manship, Adolph Weinman, and these are really important figures in the history of sculpture in the United States. And this is a really important scene from which many sculptors that scatter throughout the United States throughout the 20th century come from. So we're very lucky to have Parducci come to Detroit and be part of this lineage. At the time Parducci arrives in New York City, there is a wealthy socialite, a very influential and progressive woman who's an accomplished sculptor in her own right by the name of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. And Mrs. Whitney, I guess I should say, is interested in identifying local disadvantaged children and getting them involved in arts programs. And she will go from school to school asking teachers for the names of students that show aptitude in the arts. And one of the names that's given to her is Corrado Parducci. And as Parducci tells it in his 1975 Smithsonian interview, Whitney personally approaches his parents and asks him if he can attend sculpture classes at a local settlement house. A settlement house is basically a community center focused on assimilating newly arrived immigrants. And she gets permission, and Parducci begins to attend sculpture classes at a variety of places throughout Manhattan. And one of his earliest classes, he has an instructor by the name of Albin Polasek, who goes on to lead the sculpture department of the Chicago Institute of Arts, or maybe they call it the Institute of Art of Chicago. I can't remember for sure. But this is a pretty prestigious position, and he achieves a lasting notoriety there. And Parducci says in his interview that he starts his instruction with this guy at the age of 8. So this gives you an impression of how young Parducci has started in this career, which gives him a huge leg up over his peers in later years, the fact that he's started at such a young age. Here we see a photograph of Parducci, a New York City public school basement in 1915. And we'll also notice, looking at the caption, that his brother Rudolph Parducci is in this class with him. And we'll talk more about Rudolph in a little bit. Parducci graduates from public schools in New York around 1915, and he works as a quote unquote flower modeler in a factory for a while. This is on some census records. And he also begins to attend the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design in Manhattan, which is an extremely influential school for architectural arts at this time. Later in the early 20s, he also attends the Art Student League in Manhattan for a couple years. And this is just really super important educational background from which many notable artists over the 20th century began their careers. In addition to these very influential schools, he also takes on his first apprenticeship at the age of 17 with a man by the name of Ulysses Ricci, who comes from a group of sculptors, a sculpting family out of Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And this is a really important internship because Ulysses Ricci has contracts with a lot of the most important architectural firms in New York City at the time, including Carrera and Hastings, Cass Gilbert, Warren and Wetmore, McKim, Mead and White. So Parducci is getting exposed, again, at an extremely young age to the culture of architectural sculpture that will serve him greatly in the years coming. Also around this time, there is a building boom happening in the city of Detroit. And one of Detroit's leading architects, Albert Kahn, is getting so successful that for financial and architectural reasons, he's often traveling to New York City about once a month. And he is often hiring Ulysses Ricci. And he gets to know Ricci's operation. And somewhere along the line, he meets Parducci. And for reasons we don't know, he takes an interest in Parducci. And according to Parducci, many years before he even comes to Detroit, Kahn and some other Detroits from architect begin to give Ricci and Parducci's second master, Anthony DiLorenzo, contracts, provided that Parducci actually produces the sculpture. So already by probably about 1921, 1922, Parducci's producing sculpture that ends up on buildings in Detroit and other cities. Here we see him inside DiLorenzo's studio in 1920. He's peeking out over the left top side of the column capital there. And the most mature looking gentleman in the photograph, just underneath the dangling light fixture, is Anthony DiLorenzo. DiLorenzo is a guy that goes into business with Ricci around 1918, 1919, we estimate. And their partnership is slightly short-lived, excuse me. And they eventually part ways. And when they part ways, Parducci chooses to go with DiLorenzo instead of Ricci because DiLorenzo specializes in ornamentation and pattern work. And Parducci has a deeper interest in figurative and anatomical sculpture. And he figures if he goes with DiLorenzo, he's going to get to do more of that work. And he's right. He gets a lot of the figural work handed to him while he's at the studio. What we don't know for sure is exactly what year DiLorenzo and Ricci split. In any case, Parducci works for DiLorenzo for a few years, and they've got a lot of business, and a lot of it's coming from Detroit. And eventually in 1924, some architects in Detroit, we're not sure which ones, we have our suspicions, they insist an architectural sculpture be present for some projects that they have going on. And DiLorenzo sends Parducci to Detroit in 1924, and Parducci essentially opens a franchise office for DiLorenzo. But he realizes when he gets to Detroit, wow, there's a ton of business and just a huge boom, building boom happening here. If I separate from DiLorenzo, go off on my own, I've probably got a whole career waiting here for me. And that's exactly what he does. In October of 1925, he buys out DiLorenzo for $5,000 and takes over his interest in pretty much everything DiLorenzo has going on in Michigan at that point. So this begins a career that lasts in Detroit for over 50 years, and the ledgers enumerate over 600 commissions. We've hunted down over 300 of them. We believe there's still more to be discovered, and we're going to look at a bunch of them now. But before we go on, it's really important to make the point right here that people understand Parducci's not a guy that shows up at the building and does the carving. He's not a guy that shows up at the foundry and does the casting of the metalwork. He doesn't carve wood except as a hobby in his personal time. He makes models in clay and plaster at his studio, and then he ships them to the associated architects or construction companies for the construction the sculpture is made for. So a lot of people, when they envision Parducci, they think of him out there with a hammer and a chisel, and that pretty much never happened over the course of his career. Now, where we have an exception on Parducci showing up on person is decorative plasters. Decorative plasters like where the wall meets the ceiling or around a light fixture on the ceiling. Parducci would show up in person to start these. And then generally speaking, a larger plastering company with a staff of guys that are trained in perfect reproduction of the plaster pattern Parducci has started, they finish it off. That's a general rule. If we have a plaster design that's so unique that there's not many repeated parts of the entire plaster, well, then it's more likely that a much larger percentage of it, if not all of it, is created by Parducci's hand. And this goes for stone carving too. The guys that work on duplicating his clay models and plaster models into stone on site, they're very gifted artists in their own right, but they do not come up with the original idea. And that's why their names are less likely to be remembered in the future. All right, so now you guys have a background in Parducci's bio. Let's start looking at some of his commissions. And we're going to start off with a handful of his most famous in the Detroit area. We're going to go to another handful of really, really good commissions in the Detroit area that for some reason are not as well known as the most famous ones. We're also going to look at a few outside of the Detroit metropolis. So if anybody's interested in taking some day trips, there's a couple of close communities where you can see groupings of Parducci commissions. Excuse me. And then we'll go to commissions in the closest proximity to Livonia. And we're going to look at 6 different sites there and numerous commissions in these 6 different groupings of areas. And then we will finish off with, is my personal favorite, Corrado Parducci commissions that exist outside the state of Michigan. I took numerous cross-country trips looking for these beauties, and the results of my trips I've just been endlessly happy with. So let's start off with most famous in Detroit. Definitely right near the top, the Masonic Temple. Built 1920 to 1926, architect George D. Mason, who Parducci worked for many, many times over the course of his career. We theorize this may be one of the commissions for which he was asked to show up in person in Detroit. Here in the entry alcove, we have a bronze disc. It's very well preserved because they've covered it in plexiglass and velvet roped it since almost the beginning, and almost all the historical detail remains here, which is great because that's not always the case with floor medallions. Also in the entrance lobby, we have a revolving door that has a bronze surround that incorporates some Masonic symbolisms. And these are, of course, all Parducci designs. Also at the Masonic Temple, we have cast and carved stone. Cast stone is a lot like formed concrete, and why it's called stone, it's kind of a misnomer, but that is what it's called in the industry. This piece right here, you can kind of see trowel marks in the sculpting there. So we believe that it's more likely to be cast stone, but sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between cast and carved stone. But we assume that both are present here at the Masonic Temple. We also get carved wood designs that are based on Parducci models, many different rooms. But most importantly, at the Masonic Temple, we have, I sometimes want to say hundreds, but I'm not sure if it actually gets to 100. I think it probably is over 100 unique plaster designs here. And the one we're looking at right here is a perfect example of the style of plaster where Parducci would only start it, and then another plastering company would take over and finish it to its completion. We'll show you a couple examples of ones that Parducci did purely by his own hand a little bit later. Here's another beautiful set of plaster designs that we find, I believe this is the main lobby. And you find Parducci plaster in just about every well-decorated room inside the Masonic Temple. And Parducci talks about this commission at length in his 1975 Smithsonian interview. Important point about this commission: it was actually secured by Di Lorenzo, and Parducci took it over when he bought out Di Lorenzo. Now we're going to move to Detroit's financial district, and one of the 2 most famous skyscrapers in town. This is the Guardian Building, and its entrance on Griswold has 2 statues flanking the entrance loggia there. One is holding a sword, one is holding a key. They're known as safety and security. And you also see a little bit of ornamental work up on the top, and that is all Parducci's work. Parducci speaks at this commission at length in his interview also, and states in his pride in the fact that these carvings are slightly understated and don't quote unquote scream at you. Now we're going to look at the other of the two most famous skyscrapers in Detroit, the Fisher. And the Fisher is a very unique case because the primary sculptor here is not Parducci. It's a guy by the name of Géza Marody. He's Hungarian. He's internationally famous for a wide variety of works. And Albert Kahn is given, carte blanche to spend as much money as he wants on this construction. And Marody basically oversees pretty much all of the interior decoration here. But it's a huge job. And according to Parducci, he's a slightly prima donna-ish kind of person who is not accustomed to the pace of the work in Detroit, which in 1928, 1929 is incredibly fast. So he delegates a lot of the work to Parducci, to Anthony Di Lorenzo, and Ulysses Ritchie, three sculptors that Albert Kahn would hire regularly throughout the 1920s and early 30s. And we also have a master's thesis by a woman named Joan Botti, written in the 70s. She interviewed Parducci while writing this thesis, and this thesis covers the interior decorations of the Fisher building and who did what. And it goes into great detail, and we use this master's thesis to learn about what specific things Parducci contributed to here. Well, first of all, we've got another bronze floor medallion, and this one has not had such a pleasant fate as the one we find at the Masonic Temple. It was allowed to be walked on for years. It is now velvet rope, so what detail remains will remain, but it's unfortunate what detail has been lost. Parducci specifically states he made this bronze medallion in his 1975 Smithsonian interview, excuse me. In the body essay, Botti makes the assertion that Parducci created nearly all of the plaster ornaments in the main floor lobby and the basement lobby. And they're very much in Parducci style. This is a very easy assertion to believe. Also in this essay, this master's thesis, Parducci claims to have designed the elevator doors in the basement elevator bay. And this is a commission that is attributed to Marody in a few different historical sources. But in his interview with Botti, Parducci claims that Marody merely dictated to him what he wanted, and Parducci created the drawings all on his own, and that he had the drawings back in his studio to prove it. Now, these drawings were not found in his scrapbook images, and one of the reasons we speculate why is that he had a fire at one of his studios in the 40s, and some of the scrapbook images were lost at that time, or presumed lost at that time. And there was another point about it that I can't, oh yeah, my point is basically that we take Parducci at his word when he makes claims in interviews and his scrapbooks about what he did and did not create. And he also speaks to, the tasks that were handed to Ricci and Di Lorenzo for this commission also. Now we're gonna move into the suburbs, into Oakland County. Another extremely famous construction. This is the former residence of Matilda Dodge Wilson, and now known as Meadowbrook Hall. And Parducci's contributions to this construction are so extensive that we can think of him as one of the interior decorators here. But he also did a lot on the exterior too. Specifically, the vast majority of the carved stone is Parducci's. We speculate that some of the metalwork may be his as well, although it's more difficult to prove. But in this picture you're looking at right now, what I think is most interesting is that Parducci states in one of his interviews that he assisted in forming the bricks and firing the bricks that you see in the triple chimney design there at the top left, which I think is an awfully unique design. Moving inside now, we'll find this particular piece in the gift shop and a variety. I'm sorry, somebody's mic isn't muted. If you could go ahead and mute that. Thank you. In the gift shop, you will find a numerous sculpture in this style. And it's really kind of a compressed anatomy, but it's also really gracefully executed, in my opinion. Some of his most technically adept. And also on the exterior, you will find a series of zodiacs in stone. But what's most important at the Meadowbrook Hall is the ceiling of the Christopher Wren dining room. And this is an example of a plaster work where Parducci created the vast majority of it by his own hand because there's not many repeated elements. A little bit of the trim around the edges, maybe his studio assistants help him with this, but for the most part, it's almost all unique material. One of my favorite things about this ceiling is that it has been portrayed in a Hollywood movie. Michael Bay directed Transformers, Dark of the Moon in 2011. And the villains discussed their plans to take over the world in this room, which I think is just a very amusing representation of Detroit through Hollywood. Here's another detail of the Christopher Wren ceiling. Just a really, if you haven't toured Meadowbrook Hall, highly recommend it. Now let's look at some lesser known Parduccis in the Detroit area. If you could give me a second, I need to wet my whistle. And for some reason, these have not gotten to be as well known as some of the others that I'm guessing some of you were already familiar with. We'll start with St. Aloysius on Washington Boulevard. It's built in 1930, designed by Donaldson and Meyer. And we have three very unique tympanums over the doors in bronze here, cast bronze. They're very detailed. You get a lot more detail in metalworks than you do in stone. But also it's worth mentioning that this is a very elaborately carved facade here. And almost all of the sculpture on the facade is also by Parducci, except for the saints in the niches, which are by Samuel Cashwan, a contemporary of Parducci's. Right next door to St. Aloysius, we have Aloysius, excuse me. I always mispronounce that, please forgive me. Right next door to St. Aloysius, we have the Chancery Building. And this is built in 1924, which makes it an apprenticeship era commission for Parducci, which makes it extra important because, as I've stated before, identifying apprenticeship era works is very, very difficult. So how do we know this is an apprenticeship era work? Well, in 1958, Parducci is awarded an honorary membership in the American Institute of Architects. The ceremony is held at the Masonic Temple. One of the presenters is an architect by the name of William Capp, and William Capp's notes for his presentation at this award ceremony, we have copies of them, and he attributes this sculpture to Parducci in those notes. And because he has a close personal relationship with Parducci and hires him numerous times over the course of his career, we believe that this information almost certainly came from Parducci, and that's why Capp talks about it in the presentation. So that's our attribution case, and like I said, apprenticeship era works, really super important and really great when you can prove them. We're going to move to Ann Arbor now, and we got a building designed by William Capp, the architect we just mentioned, who worked for Smith, Inchman and Grills for many years and did many of his best designs while in their employ. And if you look over the big windows on the second story there, you'll see different disciplines represented in classically inspired statues. There's also a few that are obscured by the pine trees underneath the flanking windows. And then in the entryways there, you'll see some Art Deco flourishes over the doors. If we get really close to the building and look at the crisscross patterns over the first floor doors and windows there, we're going to find these little guys also designed by Parducci. And cast, I believe this is bronze, but sometimes I'm not that skilled at identifying exact metals. If we go further onto U of M's campus, to the Tappan Hall on South University Street. This is a building built in the late 19th century and designed by Spear and Roans. And it houses a U of M fine arts library. And in the main lobby of this building, we have a glass encased example of an original Parducci plaster from when the Rackham School was built. And if we look really closely, we can see dimples all over the model here. Those dimples are from what's called a pointing machine. And this is like an octopi-ish kind of, bunch of rulers put together that perfectly measures like perspective and depth and distance. And this is a tool that a lot of your stone carvers use to make sure that they perfectly reproduce the artist's vision in stone on the building. Like I said before, these are very talented artists. They just don't come up with the original idea like Parducci does. Another great thing about this fine arts library building here in the University of Michigan is that it houses the library that contains the essay by Joan Botti that tells us so much about the interior decoration of the Fisher building. And I just really love unique interconnections in history like that. Now we're gonna go to come near my neck of the woods. This building's about half a mile from me at the corner of 12 Mile and Woodward in Royal Oak. We have the National Shrine of the Little Flower. The most important thing that I can teach you all about the sculpture at the National Shrine of the Little Flower is that Parducci is the secondary sculptor here. The primary sculptor, the guy who produced the models for the crucified Christ on the tower and almost all of the associated sculpture at the base, his name is René Paul Chambellan, and he's a significantly more famous and probably execute sculpture more gracefully than Parducci. And he does the majority of the work for the portions of the building that are built 1929 and 1931, which is the tower, and the stuff around the base. The church gets built from 33 to 35. I personally believe that the vast majority of the sculpture inside of the church is based on Parducci models. My co-author Einar, he debates me on this, and he believes that some of Chambellan's models have also been incorporated here. So it's a really great place where you can have debates about who created what. We're gonna look at stuff, obviously, that I feel Parducci created. But please remember, when you're pointing this site out to people as you drive down the road, the tower sculpture is by René Paul Chambellan. Most important sculpture by Parducci here, by far, is the Stations of the Cross. These are really super elaborate, detailed, beautiful. One of the docents here tells me they're insured for over $1 million. Another really important detail about them is that they're a tandem, they're sculpted in tandem, and Rudolph Parducci, Parducci's brother, is the other sculptor. And Alan Parducci, the son, is the person that gives us this information. And he tells us that Parducci, his father, Corrado, he did the rough-in, and that Rudolph completed most of the fine detail, which makes sense because Rudolph is also a jeweler and is very into fine detail. Also, we find fully disengaged elements here on a relief, which is pretty rare for Corrado, but the kind of thing you would expect with somebody who is more into fine detail. So there's a lot of circumstantial clues here that also back up Alan's assertion that Rudolph contributed here. Rudolph lives in Detroit and works with Corrado from approximately 1929 to 1936. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a second here. But I include a lot of pictures of these Stations of the Cross because I love it so much. And they're very friendly here at the National Shrine of the Little Flower. They love to have visitors who just want to tour and see the art. I highly recommend a visit, and I encourage you all to make an offering. The upkeep on the art and a structure of this nature is not cheap, and it's basically like having a museum in your backyard. Here's another example inside the Shrine of the Little Flower with the Queen of All Saints altar here. We have examples where we would debate on whether it's Parducci or Chambellan based on the fact that we have no scrapbook images proving that it's Parducci. I personally believe this one's Parducci, but it's not provable. What is provable is the trim around the edge, the octagonal entryway there, and all those pattern work that's confirmed by images in Parducci's scrapbook. On the outside, we have carved stone, possibly cast. We've got about 4 in this exact style that are also confirmed by scrapbook images. Also on the outside, we have grill work over some windows that are not confirmed by scrapbook images, but have enough stylistic points that we're convinced Parducci created the models for these. And the last thing we'll touch on in the National Shrine of the Little Flower is a lectern that's added in 1965. Parducci and Father Coughlin have a slight falling out after the building of the church in the 1930s because Father Coughlin would like him to create a relief of a political assassination. And Parducci he's not into it. He doesn't want to do it, and he refuses to do it, and it leads to a falling out, and Coughlin doesn't hire him again for 30 years. And Parducci speaks of this 1965 commission as something of a reunion with Coughlin. So let's step outside of Detroit for just a second here and look at just 2 places in the state where we can see really significant Parducci commissions that are not in the city of Detroit. In Saginaw and Midland, we're only going to touch on 3, but they're really important ones. This first one is the Second National Bank building, right in the heart of downtown Saginaw. It's a really easy hop, skip, and a jump off the freeway. And this is the second entry in Parducci's ledgers after he gets to Detroit. So a commission that is almost certainly secured by Di Lorenzo, but the vast majority of the sculpture, we believe, is executed by Parducci. The possibility exists that Di Lorenzo contributes, but we can't say for sure. I love this full range photo of the building, and that's why I include it here. But I promise you, if you stop to see this, you will be very pleased with how many more sculptural details there are on this building than just the cameo you see on the right. So that's really important early work. Here's another super important Parducci piece that has a great story to go with it. This is a plaster that was created for the Midland Theater in the early 1940s. It's almost all unique with no repeated elements, so we can be pretty sure that Parducci created the vast majority of it by its own hand. So this is installed in the Midland Theater in the 1940s, but in the 1970s or 80s probably, possibly even the 60s, they have a renovation and for some crazy reason decide they want to cover this up. Fast forward to the 90s, when they're getting ready to tear this building down, luckily there's a very conscientious demolitions company. They tear out a wall, they find this underneath, and they decide this is historically significant, and they make some calls, and they manage to put together a historical preservation project that gets this plaster dismantled and reinstalled at the Herbert B. Doane Midland County History Center around 2003. Over the course of this project, one of the Dow companies invests some money. I believe it's Dow Corning, I can't remember for sure. And they have a bronze casting of this plaster made to be placed in a public park in Midland, Ned S. Arbery Park. And this is so great because it's really the only example we have of a Parducci work that's cast after his lifetime is over, about 20 years after, in fact. We're gonna move to Lansing now. Lansing is the one city in the United States, in the world, that has the most Parducci sculpture without being Detroit, basically. So if you take a day trip to Lansing, you're gonna have about 12 Parduccis there to examine. We're gonna look at 9 of them right now. The most important ones, in my opinion, are the ones that are in the downtown area. And we have 6 right within a 6-block radius of the capital of Michigan. We're gonna look at 4 of those. First one is the Michigan Bell Office on North Capitol Ave. The first wave of construction here is 24, the second is 36. The sculpture is added to the original wing to unify the 2 structures, we believe, in 1936, but we are a little bit unclear of this building's construction history. Right across the street at Central United Methodist Church, an interior chapel that's added in, geez, I can't see the date. My own video feed is covering it, but I think it was 45, maybe 48. I could be off. This is inside, so if you want to see it, you need to plan to go to the church on the day that they're opening, that they're open, that they're having services. And you'll also find an altar in this chapel that has similar pattern work to what you see on the sides of this memorial plaque here. Now we're real close to the Capitol, right across the street. The Michigan National Bank Tower is actually the tallest building in Ingham County in Lansing, and it's built in the 30s. And when they build it, they hire Ulysses Ricci, Parducci's master, to produce the exterior sculpture. It's really great stuff. When they do an addition in the mid-60s, they hire Parducci, the next best thing. Ulysses Ricci is gone at this point. And Parducci produces stylistically congruous sculpture for the addition that is just to the east of the main building. The architect, Kenneth C. Black, is a guy that Parducci ends up executing numerous commissions for over the course of his career. Here's another one by Black, right down the street, about 3 blocks, maybe 4 blocks from the Capitol. This is basically the Lansing Public Library's main branch, but they call it the Clarence H. Rosa branch. And these sculpted panels that we see on the side here are printer's marks from famous American publishers. And sometimes you call these colophons. That's a specific jargonish word to describe these symbols that you sometimes see in old books. Throughout the rest of Lansing, you're going to find a few more. I'm convinced there's probably some that we have not been able to identify as Lansing commissions yet. Sometimes the ledgers, they can be unclear, and you have to make a lot of inferences to get it right. But here's a few others you find around town, spanning the years of 37 to 62, I believe. And the most important one here is by far J.W. Sexton High School, because of the amount of sculpture on the facade. Between all the walls there and the auditorium, there's probably over 40 pieces by Parducci. There's also a piece in East Lansing, but I'll just tease you with it in the hopes that it interests you in purchasing my book. Let's look at stuff that is in the closest proximity to Livonia now. There's a few small commissions that, you know, are 2 to 3 miles from the city limits that I've omitted just because there's not a ton of stuff there. It's very small works. I've tried to include mostly stuff that I consider really significant because of how much is grouped in one small area. And we are going to start off about 5 miles from the Livonia city limits at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. This is built in the late 20s, and the architect was Robert O'Derrick, another architect for whom Parducci created sculpture many times over the course of his career. Parducci creates models for the carved exterior stone here that might even be marble. And he also creates numerous gorgeous plaster patterns, decorative plaster patterns on the interior. One of my favorite things about this commission is the fact that we have extra documentation held at the Benson Ford Research Center, which is located right at the entrance to Greenfield Village. And this contract record shows actually more work than Parducci's ledgers show. So we theorize that a lot of things aren't reported in Parducci's ledgers, and they actually created the ledgers late in his career from memory and incomplete records. And that's why we frequently find evidence that Parducci actually produced more for specific sites than is recorded in his ledger. We go right across the street from the museum here to the Dearborn Inn just a couple years later, another Kahn design. And we've got a couple more plaster patterns here. And this outer ring of these plaster patterns, you can see, we're going to go backwards here just a little bit. It's very similar to what's happening on some of the plaster patterns at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. So stylistic similarities are something we look for all the time because stylistic similarities back up our attributions. Also, when we're in this part of town, we might as well go look at the Ford Motor Company Engineering Laboratory in Dearborn, right next door to the Henry Ford, because it has a bunch of examples of Ulysses Ricci sculpture from Parducci's apprenticeship era. Now, I believe, and most of the people I've discussed this would believe, that these are by Ricci, but this is in the era where, Kahn is hiring Ricci, Parducci, and Di Lorenzo to team up to decorate buildings. So the possibility always exists that perhaps a Parducci contributed here as well. Me personally, I feel like it shows a more of Ricci style, but they're so similar, at some points indistinguishable. So this is a really important local commission for understanding, where Parducci's, background comes from and who you can compare him to else in his lineage. Oops, I went backwards, excuse me. Here's one more piece by Ulysses Ricci on the engineering laboratory. And I just love this one to death. I highly recommend seeing these in person. Now we're going to move over to St. Scholastica and Old Redford Academy. It's right there at the corner of Outer and Southfield Freeway. This is about 4.7 miles away from the city limits of Livonia, and we've got a grouping of about 6 different commissions here. We'll start with the church, a deal and deal design from the mid-60s, and this is on the altar. Deal and Deal is another firm for whom Parducci completes many commissions over the years. Right next door at the school, this is now known as Cornerstone Academy, I believe. And originally it's known as St. Scholastica School, and is built in 1939 with some subsequent additions. This is on the facade that faces the Southfield Freeway. And also right in this general area, even though the address says Rosemont, we have the St. Sylvester Benedictine Monastery that is accessible from the parking lots of St. Scholastica School and Church. And this is another deal and deal design from the late 30s, and it's got Parducci sculpture all over it. Really lovely stuff. Go across the Southfield Freeway to Old Redford Academy High School, formerly known as St. Benedictine High School. I'm not sure who the architect is here, but Parducci's got stuff on a couple different walls here. And also in the 50s, he is commissioned to create a freestanding statue of St. Benedict that gets a lot of public fanfare. It even gets mentioned in the Free Press, but they misspell Parducci's name and they call him Perducci. Not that big a deal, but kind of amusing to me. You can see this, if you park in the parking lot and look through a fence, you can see this without going on their campus. Now we're going to move to another spot in Dearborn. I think we're getting a little closer to the Livonia city limits now. I think maybe we're about 3 miles away. And at the Divine Child Catholic community, we have a high school, a church, and an elementary school, all of which have Parducci sculpture on them. And we believe all of them were designed by Herman and Simons, but we're not 100% on the elementary school. The Church of the Divine Child is very reminiscent. The sculpture here is very reminiscent of the Della Robbia family of Renaissance era Italy. And they are famous for creating, images of Christ in swaddling cloth, and also like cherubs with disembodied cherubs that just have wings on the side here. These are the kind of things that the Della Robbia family sculpts. Luca and Andrea were the most famous members of the family. And this just kind of shows that the lineage of architectural sculpture being produced by Parducci, it goes way, way back all the way to Renaissance era Italy. There's another Christ in swaddling cloth on the high school. And then on the elementary school, we have a Lamb of God holding a flag. Moving on now to Holy Sepulchre Cemetery on 10 Mile Road in Southfield. I think we're about maybe 2.25 miles from the city limits now here. Another great grouping where we have multiple Parducci commissions from multiple eras. We're going to start off with the Frank Navin Mausoleum. Frank Navin was a former owner of the Detroit Tigers. The sculpture here is sparse. As far as we know, we can only see the trim on the outside, but there could possibly be some interior work too. We're not sure. We've never been inside of it. We move on to the public mausoleum here. The exterior sculpture is Parducci, as is the interior. I've got a Holy Family here. There's a little bit of repair on I believe it's Christ's chin here that kind of mars it, but still a decent piece nonetheless. And if we look around in this mausoleum, we're going to find a special niche for a kid named Peter White, who very tragically died in a crash over the Grand Canyon involving 2 planes in 1956. And this was a huge news story in 1956. It was the front page of most newspapers nationally. It killed, I think, 120 something people, and 13 were Detroiters. Peter White came from a very affluent family who had the means to create purchase a special niche for him here at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. And they enlisted Parducci to create the models from which the wood ornaments inside this memorial are carved. And here we see a handful of headlines reporting this crash. 128 is your death total, 13 from Detroit. They speak about it in the Free Press, and of course they give a little section just for Peter White there. He was considered to be quite a promising youth. Also on the grounds of the cemetery, a family memorial for a fellow named L.A. Edwards, a business figure in Detroit at the time, 1960s. And there's also a plot here of archbishops and bishops of the Catholic Church, Archdiocese of Detroit, that we suspect is probably Parducci sculpture, but we don't have a corresponding ledger entry to prove it. So that's more of a suspicion than an actual proven commission. Now we're getting real close to Livonia, and this is a really huge Parducci commission. He states in his interview that he produced over $50,000 worth of sculpture for St. John's Seminary, another deal design. And if you translate that $50,000 to modern figures, we're talking, I'd guess somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000. And you can really see that Parducci has contributed heavily here. You can't in this picture though. This is the chapel, and I just love this picture to death. That's why I've included it here, just so we get an idea of what kind of expense is invested in this place when it is built in the late 40s primarily. But there's really not any Parducci shown here. I just happen to love to show up this photo. If we move to a side chapel inside this chapel, though, we have a side altar here that is definitely Parducci and very representative of his style throughout his career, because he does the symmetrical birds facing each other or facing away from each other. He does that like at least 50, possibly up to 100 times over the course of his career. And this is also carved in a really expensive marble also, which makes it extra gorgeous. Also in the entry lobby of St. John's Provincial Seminary, now known as the Inn at St. John's, you'll find very nice plaster ceilings, also representative of Parducci style. And if we look at this line, this triple course line that's braided through here, we'll find that we have some elements here in different materials where Parducci attempts to stylistically integrate material to material, which is kind of a step forward in his creative process that we don't really see in the earlier years. In fact, we see some examples in the earlier years of incongruous subject matter placed side by side on buildings. And this to me is one of the first indicators of Parducci trying to achieve a certain stylistic synthesis from material to material. There's also some great exterior carvings there over the main entrance and a few of the doors that I recommend. All right, we finally made it to the one Parducci in Livonia. This is the Villa St. Felix, also known as the Felician Sisters Convent and Chapel. This is on Schoolcraft Road between Newburgh and Lavon. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. You guys can correct me when I'm done here. This is designed by O'Meara and Hills, but they have a couple of associates in their offices at the time, one by the name of Mcdougall, one by the name of Quick, and they form a partnership later in the 60s when they finish off this structure, and they are the architects of record for the later era stuff. And most of our exterior work here is by Parducci. Some of it's confirmed by scrapbook images, some of it confirmed by the ledger, and some of it confirmed by the fact that it is just really similar to other stuff Parducci does over the course of his career. In fact, over the course of his career, he executes the symbolic evangelists that we see here. Another common element of church architecture that he probably executes close to 50 times over the course of his career, and he has to try to do it in a different way each time, which is really what makes him fascinating. Not that he's doing different things every time, that he's doing the same thing every time in a different way. Here's some really unique column capitals that you really don't see a lot like this in his repertoire. But you know, Parducci's signature style is given away by the folds of the garments, which is one of the #1 stylistic indicators when you're trying to determine if something is a Parducci or not. So that was the local stuff. And if you'd allow me just a moment, I'd love to share with you a handful of my favorites that I discovered outside of the state of Michigan over the course of numerous trips I took. And the ledgers guided me on almost all of these. And there was a lot of places I showed up with where there was no longer any Parducci. Maybe it was a plaster pattern that got scraped off. But these are ones I've discovered outside of the state of Michigan that I find really exciting. This Huntington Library commission is super important because it is the earliest known applied sculpture that we can attribute to Parducci. This was produced for the Huntington Library around 1920, and we are informed of its origin by, first of all, Parducci's son Alan, who when he moved out to California permanently in the 1940s was told by his father, I have work on the Huntington Library doors that you can see while I'm there. But also he mentions it in a 1979 interview with a woman named Faye Hendry, who produced a few books about architectural sculpture in smaller cities of Michigan. Those records are stored at Conrad Hall on the campus of Michigan State University. And in this interview, Parducci states that he produced colophons for these doors. And as we've already mentioned, colophons are printer's marks. Well, what you see before you are not printer's marks. So these are panels from the door that we cannot prove by Parducci. What we can prove is that he produced at least 2 colophons, probably more, but it's not 100%. So here's a colophon on the Huntington Library doors. And this is a really, expensive, prestigious construction at this time in the suburban Los Angeles. And they go back to really early printers to get their symbols. And we can see that this is drawn from a colophon from a book published in London, England in 1530. Now, because there's 8 colophons on this building, can we say definitively this one's by Parducci? No, we can't. We can only say that we know he did at least 2, but we don't know which 2. He probably did this one, but we can't be certain. In any case, if you look at the way that the leg in the foreground is fashioned here, it is incredibly similar to the way either Parducci or Ricci would do it. So it strengthens our attribution somewhat, but you know, there's a lot of historical mystery in this one. What we can say for certain is Parducci contributed to these doors. Just recently, in my archive of photos I've taken around Michigan, I stumbled upon another rendering of the Huntington Library doors in Marquette, Michigan. This is such a recent discovery for me that I am not even sure that the administrators at the Huntington, which is now a very well-attended tourist site, if they are aware of this casting, and I'm waiting to hear back from them. But in any case, because it's an exact same casting of the exact same doors, we can also say that here at the First National Bank and Trust Company building in downtown Marquette, we also have an apprenticeship era Parducci sculpture. So you guys have probably noticed the sculpture behind me that you've been looking at this entire presentation. This is another apprenticeship era work, and the proving the origin is difficult to people who you know a lot about Adolf Weinman and know a lot about Parducci's master Anthony Di Lorenzo. And I have to tell you why, so that you guys know how we can prove this is a Parducci. Our theory is that, well, this part isn't a theory. The contract for the architectural sculpture here was definitely given to Adolf Weinman, but in this day and age, it's very common for architectural sculptors to subcontract portions of a building sculpture, or to hand off the less prestigious parts of the building to underlings, apprentices. So our theory is that Weinman subcontracts Di Lorenzo, and Di Lorenzo hands off the brass and the stone reveal to Parducci. So how do we know Parducci produced them? Because he has images of them in his scrapbook, and he speaks specifically.
Dale, I'm sorry. Dale,
yes.
It seems that you turned your volume down.
Oh, did I? Is I'm hearing, oh, are you hearing me fine now, or?
I'm not able.
Hold on a second.
Can you hear me? Not if you can hear me.
I can totally hear you, but I'm not sure why. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Can somebody else speak up and say they still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, very.
Okay.
You're good.
I can hear you.
All right.
I can hear you fine.
All right. Sorry about the
You're breaking
interruption.
up a little.
The joy of broadcasting over Zoom. Thank you for everybody speaking up, though. I appreciate it. Sounds like everybody's still hearing me clearly. Hope I'm not taking too long. Sometimes I tend to go a little over. But where was I on this commission? Oh, yes. Parducci specifically states that he did the brass and stonework here in an interview, and he also includes images of this work in his scrapbook. And we take Parducci at his word when he asserts you know, the work he has done creating these pieces. So there's often debates about the origin of this piece because of the contract awarded to Weinman. Some people want to attribute it to Weinman, and some people also want to attribute it to John Polachek Bronze and Iron Company of New York City because they cast it. And they're right, he had a huge role in producing it, but they used Parducci's models to make the casting. And that's really the most important part, is where the original idea for the images come from. So when somebody says Polachek, they're not wrong, but they're not entirely right. I've got a bunch of images here because I love this commission so much. It might possibly be my favorite Parducci anywhere in the United States. And we don't have any known Parducci outside of the United States. We've looked really hard in Windsor with no luck. I wish I could turn something up there, though. This is actually known as the history of money among the very, very small group of people who study this kind of thing. And you'll see that it depicts actual smelting and minting of coins and, weighing of gold and trading of items at the market. And Parducci also attests to have creating the stone reveals, which are also quite elaborate, but we do not get as much detail in stone as we get in metal. All right, we're going to move to Chicago now, where we're very fortunate to have an Albert Kahn design. Chicago has its own roster of legendary architects creating throughout the city in this era, so it's really uncommon for them to bring somebody from out of town. So this is great. It still stands. Unfortunately, the club disbanded in the last couple of years, and the fate of the building is uncertain, which underscores a major reason I do this work. When buildings like this are torn down and no sculpture is saved, it's absolutely heartbreaking, but at least we have a photo record. An interesting historical fact about this club is at the time of its construction, the fathers of the famous murderers, Leopold and Loeb, are members here. And the murder gets so much press attention that it actually, according to Parducci in his interview with the Smithsonian historian, it slows down construction in the middle of the building. Really sumptuous, ornate, elaborate, extensive work here. Another one of my favorite Parducci commissions. Now we're going to go to New York City. This is the only Parducci I've been able to zero in on New York, despite the fact that he probably has quite a few commissions here from his apprenticeship era, but we've already covered how difficult it is to prove that. This is in his ledgers. It's an Albert Kahn design, so it's pretty easy to prove. And on a less serious note, I always get a kick out of pointing out to people the treatment of the stomach and the breasts here, because if you look closely, it looks a lot like Beaker from the Muppets. And once you see it that way, you really can't see it any other way. All right, this is a really super important commission, but another one where it's kind of hard to prove Parducci's involvement. We have a $9,000 ledger entry in 1929 for this building, which is very substantial. But what we also have is a very, very thorough historical record that enumerates the numerous sculptors that contributed to this building. People like Lee Laurie, Angela Gregory, Adolf Weinman, there's a few others. And the major sculpture here is so well chronicled that it begins to be difficult to identify things by Parducci specifically, because in the newspaper accounts of the day, only his brother Rudolph is personally named, and he's working for a sculptor based in Louisiana at this point. So when we go to the Louisiana State Capitol, well, what we're looking for is trim that is not attributed to more famous sculptors than Parducci. And these are the parts that we feel where Parducci has made his major contributions. Here's an example on the inside, on the right side here, you see a fascie with some flattened stylized flowers. This is very much in Parducci style, but it's just trim, so it's not attributed to any of the other major sculptors that contributed. So this is just one example among many of trim pieces at the Louisiana State Capitol that we believe likely to have been created by Parducci. You'll also see all kinds of trim around the figurative work when we're looking up at the pinnacle here. And only the major statues are attributed. So any amount of a trim work here could be Parducci. $9,000 is a very large sum in 1929. So we do know that he did extensive work here. One more piece of evidence that I love showing people is a recommendation letter from Albert Kahn to the architects of the Louisiana State Capitol, Weiss, Dreyfus, and Seifert, dated 1930. Again, not proof of Parducci's contributions, but another piece in our attribution case. And now we're going to move to Albany, New York, which another very historically important commission. This is executed in the very late eras of Parducci's career, the late 1970s. And what makes this such an important commission is the importance of this construction in American history, designed by Stanford White and Henry Hobson Richardson, who are two of the most important figures in American architectural history. In fact, Hobson Richardson can practically be described as the godfather of American architecture. Stanford White who later goes on to form McKim, Mead and White, New York City's most, I think most architectural historians would agree, the most important firm in New York City's history. He is a figure that is probably the most important in terms of bringing the European tradition of architectural sculpture to the United States. And when in the process of doing this, one of the groups of people that he educates on the precedents in Europe is the Ricci family of Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And one of the people that is spawned by this group, Ulysses Ricci, the most prolific of the Riccis, he goes on to be Parducci's master. So this is kind of a return to his Manhattan roots for Parducci, and it's happening really late in his career too. And we confirm these commissions with a lot of correspondence between Parducci's office and the acting architects of the New York State Capitol at this time. But also we have a wonderful studio image of Parducci actually creating the clay models. They ended up switching the cameos, the heads of the architects of the Capitol. There was numerous over the years, but for the most part, this is the exact pattern you're looking at in the previous picture. And finally, finishing up now here, Alan Parducci's personal residence in Los Angeles, California, where he keeps quite a few pieces by his father. And these are pieces that are done by Parducci in his spare time, not for commissions. So this is a very, very rare examples of stuff that is chiseled by Parducci's own hand. Also, the piece on the right, it's a huge stylistic departure from anything we see by Parducci throughout his career. So we really love this piece too. Also in Alan's, oh, I'm sorry, showing you a picture with me with Alan first. This is in September of 2019 when I'm finishing up the book, and spent a day with Alan. We visited the Huntington Library and saw his dad's work there. And also in Alan's living room, he keeps a plaster sculpture of himself at about 7 years old, his mother in her late 20s or early 30s, I believe late 20s. Her name was Rebecca. And also a collection of maquettes, which are basically small models that the architectural sculpture shows the client to give them an example of what the larger sculpture will look like. And maquette is spelled just like Marquette, but with no R in it. And finally, the last piece by Parducci in the collection is a Christmas card from 1952. Alan tells us, and we have scrapbook images that back it up. His father produced these metal Christmas cards for many, many years on end. And Alan was often enlisted to assist, and he says he didn't like it, and that his father would usually have these completed around the February after the holiday. So that's my presentation, you guys. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that it piqued your interest and that you will be interested in procuring my book. It's available at the Detroit Artist Market in Detroit, at Book Beat in Oak Park. After the pandemic is brought under control, I hope to get it in a few more locations. And if you don't care to go out, I don't blame you. You can go to Amazon.com and search Corrado Parducci, and my book's pretty much the first thing that will come up. Also, if you found yourself particularly fond of any of the photography in my presentation, I'm very happy to make prints and sell to anybody who's interested. If you are, you're more than welcome to contact me at my personal email. I also love sharing items in my Parducci archive with anybody. The more eyes we get on the research material, the larger our chances of uncovering extant Parduccis that I haven't come across yet and Einar hasn't come across yet. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Ken and run a question and answer session. I'd especially love it if anybody wants to ask about a specific community and if there is a Parducci present therein.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating, Dale. I want to thank you so much for such a lively and informative presentation. I also want to recommend to all of our attendees, go and buy the book, and you can take the book on a field trip and use the book to guide you on your field trip to go and see all of the local installations by Corrado Parducci. Okay, we do have some questions. There are some comments as well. So let's see if maybe we can go to the comments first. Timothy B says, And Dale, if you have any reaction to the comments, that's fine.
Okay.
Timothy B says, cool virtual background, Dale. Yeah, and thanks for explaining about the virtual background too. That was really, really cool.
My pleasure.
Let's see here. And Timothy B has a comment. He says, if someone wants to take a photo of the Mary Sabina Chapel plaque inside the Central United Methodist Church in downtown Lansing, you will need a good camera because the lighting there is not very good.
I agree with that observation, Timothy. But I practice a form of photography known as high dynamic resolution, and I shoot almost exclusively on a tripod. And if you use the tripod and make long exposures, you can get very crisp, well lit images, even in the darkest of night. In fact, I specialize in night photography. It's my favorite time to shoot, and I highly recommend you look at trying to do less snap shooting and more tripod shooting if you want to get the crispest images of architectural art possible.
Okay, Robert W says, I'm a docent at Cranbrook House, and our script says the ceiling in the still room of Cranbrook House is by Parducci.
I'm afraid that's inaccurate. It's actually by Ricci, Parducci's master. And I was informed of this ceiling by Gregory Whitcop, who I believe is pretty much the head of the archivists there at Cranbrook. And it's a really great commission, and I'm glad you brought it up because Ricci is so influential on Parducci. And this, I can't say I've looked as hard into it as I have with Parducci stuff, but I have looked into Ricci's presence here in Detroit and Michigan, and there's a lot. And this is the earliest example I can find of Ricci's involvement in the Detroit metro area. There may be earlier examples that I haven't come across yet, but I believe that's from about 1917. And it's really, really nice stuff. I highly recommend anybody who gets a chance to tour the Cranbrook House to do it and ask specifically to see the still room. And that still room is pronounced, spelled, I believe, S-T-I-J-L. I believe it's a Dutch word.
Okay, we can go on to the questions now. And I just want to remind our attendees, if you want to send a question, you can use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and type in your question. So this question by Robert W. Is she of the Whitney House on Woodward? And I assume he's talking about Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney.
Uh-huh.
Do you know anything about that?
Can you please repeat the question? I'm sorry, I was looking for where they're actually written here on my, I think I found it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you should be able to view the questions as well. And again, this is by Robert W. And he wants to know, is she, and I assume he means Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, of the Whitney House on Woodward?
No, that Whitney is a lumber baron, but the family that she is related to is Gloria Vanderbilt, the famous fashion designer. You've maybe heard of the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. That's also her family's making. Anderson Cooper is a descendant in this family also. And the Whitney Museum in New York City is actually named for her, and she's one of the founders. This is a really super influential, important, progressive, very accomplished woman for her day that's acting in fields that are largely dominated by men. So I think that a lot of feminist thinkers in America are very, they think very highly of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. I personally do too.
Okay. Robert W., one more question here. He says, I don't know how a plaster art piece is created. Is it formed wet or carved dry, etc.?
Well, we're getting a little bit out of my area of art expertise here, Robert. So, I mean, I can speculate for you a little bit and I can give you some accurate information, but my expertise is more in the area of, hunting down commissions and knowing years that they were created and who the architects were. So as far as process goes, I can only, speak a little bit about it. But to the best of my knowledge, plaster models are almost always created when they're wet, and that applies to both plaster models that are created in studio to be carved later, as well as plaster decorations that you see, around light fixtures and ceilings in really fancy buildings. I have an example in my photo archive of Parducci's mixing tools. They're held by the Detroit Historical Museum. They have a storage facility at Fort Wayne. And excuse me. And in these tools, you'll actually find like one of those old spin mixers that you use for pudding and stuff at home, and that's what he would use to mix plaster. So that gives us an almost pretty much a guarantee that at least on some level, he's applying plaster wet when he's forming sculpture.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Timothy B has a question. Any guesses about how many Parduccis that you know about or suspect they were are now destroyed or you couldn't find?
Too many, first of all. And that is one of the reasons I engage in this kind of research and photography, is because I feel with many of these buildings, at some point, the photographic record is all we're going to have left. And there's so many instances of that in Detroit. So yes, there's a lot. And there's a lot where the building is currently endangered. There's a lot where the building is, has been abandoned for many years. There's fortunately quite a few also that, and I mean, I would really give a lot of credit to Dan Gilbert on this front, that have been saved because of the investment, the massive investment that Bedrock has made in real estate in downtown Detroit. A lot of people have very strong opinions about it one way or the other, and I respect all of that. But at the end, I believe that Gilbert's company deserves a ton of respect for what he has done for architectural preservation in the city of Detroit.
Thank you.
Sorry, I got off on a little bit of a tangent there.
That's okay. It's we love your enthusiasm here. Gene S asks, was he implementing design specifically requested by the architect, or was he stamping his own mark on most of his commissions?
That's a great question. And the answer is somewhere in the middle, because Parducci speaks to his process quite a bit in the interviews we draw upon. And he talks a lot about how with architects that were repeat customers, which is the vast majority of his catalog, eventually he gains enough trust with these architects that they can just give him a really minimal amount of information about what they want and trust him to execute it properly. And this gets more common, the longer he's in town for, and the more these guys are familiar with this process. What's also really notable is that Parducci is a master of many different styles, historically speaking. And if the building has a historical style, Parducci can almost always match it. So in that sense, a lot of times Parducci's actually casting away his personal, touch on things and trying to stay true to the historical style. But, he also mentions in his interviews a few times that some aspects of his education were informal enough that when he's asked to do something Greek or he's asked to do something classical, he does Parducci Greek, meaning that he's trying to emulate classical Greek, but it's still got a little bit of his personal touch to it. I highly recommend that you take a look at the Smithsonian interview with Dennis Berry that is posted on the Smithsonian Archives of American Art website. It's accessible to all. It's completely transcribed. There are a lot of misspellings of artist name in there, but it's super, super informative and one of my #1 sources. And that question you just asked will be further addressed in the text of that interview.
Thank you, Dale. Gene S has one more question. Have you found additional Parducci designs in any of these older churches in Detroit that are now closed or risking being closed? Donaldson and Meyer designed many of these, and it seems Parducci worked with them at times.
Yes, absolutely. And some other architects also. On Quincy Street, for example, we have a really, really early example. You know what? I've got my, give me 1 second to look up the name of it. Also, St. Patrick's, originally known as the Chapel of the Little Flower on Parsons in Detroit. This is a speculative entry in our book, but stylistically, it's so much like Parducci, and he's got such a record of working with Donaldson and Meyer that we believe the sculpture decoration on this church is by Parducci. And that's like right next to Orchestra Hall where the DSO perform. You know, it's kind of a church that's been forgotten by history a little bit, so you might not be familiar with it. But let me tell you about this one on Quincy Street also. St. Teresa of Avila, that's from 1924. It's a Van Leyen, Schilling, and Keogh design, who we worked for many times over the course of his career. Also, and this is a church that's currently occupied, but it changes hands every few years, which, you know, makes you wonder if the congregations inhabiting it have enough money to, upkeep what architectural sculpture requires. This is a St. Bridget on Schoolcraft over by like Indiana and Ohio, those streets. And it's got some amazing Parducci all over the outside and on the inside. And that is a great example of a really grandiose Catholic church of the past that I feel if it goes vacant, it's really in danger. Also, at one time across, it's not being done right now. One of the congregations along the way covered up some of the Parducci with an emblem for their own church over the middle tympanum, which, I'm against. I'm for the church being inhabited, whoever wants to inhabit it, but don't cover up Parducci sculpture. I'm ethically opposed to that. So those are just a few examples, and there are others, definitely. You can find a few in the book.
Well, Armando D, you definitely nailed it. Yes, St. Teresa's on Quincy. You were correct. This looks like our last question. This is again by Armando D. And his question.
Delicato, who has shown up to quite a few of my presentations and is also a Facebook friend of mine and who appears to know quite a bit about sculpture history. Go ahead with Armando's question.
Well, this is a very interesting one then. Holy Name Church in Birmingham has a Parducci statue above the main door. Very different than the other Parduccis. Do you know anything about it?
I do. One of the reasons it's so different is that it's made out of fiberglass, which is kind of a space age material for this era of ecclesiastical sculpture creation. And I know about it being fiberglass from an article that appeared in the Michigan Catholic around the time of the church's consecration. I personally don't find that sculpture to be one of Parducci's most graceful executions, but I do consider it very significant because of the space age materials at that time that are being used. It doesn't look a lot like fiberglass from the outside because it's painted and it really mimics the appearance of stone well. But yeah, I do know about that one. Also, there's an altar sculpture that was removed from the altar and put in the narthex there quite a few years back, and that's very nice too. And also the stained glass there is just phenomenal, and it was designed by a peer, a contemporary of Parducci's by the name of Andrew Malia. The G is silent, who I talked about with Kenneth earlier today, because Ken has a silent G in his name also.
Indeed, I do. Well, Dale, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for appearing today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we'll also be telling other librarians in our cooperative about tonight's presentation as well. So hopefully you'll get some calls from that. Also, I will be in touch with you in the morning via email.
Sounds great. Thank you all for coming tonight.
And again, I do want to thank all of our attendees. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We hope to see you at any of our future programs coming up. And when we can reopen the library, we hope to see you in the library. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye
Well
now.
done.